Technology isn't just a part of our everyday lives anymore. It's become a frontier for global powers, with India right in the mix. So why not join the conversation? Take the Technopolitics survey created by researchers at the Takshashila Institution. It's just 10 simple questions, but your answers could help shape India's strategy in navigating the fast changing world of high tech geopolitics. Your voice matters, so let's make it heard.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to this episode of All Things Policy. I'm Shreya, and I'll be your host for today. At a time when the labor force participation of women in India continues to lag significantly behind that of men, it begs asking if a lot still remains unchanged for women. Is a woman's right to participation in leisure an unaddressed and growing challenge? Joining me today are my colleagues and fellow leisure enthusiasts, Rijesh and Kripa. I guess Kripa will, along with her observations, also share a little bit from her experiences as a woman. And Rijesh is going to speak for all men.
Oh, no pressure, Rijesh.
I feel sorry for the poor guys on whose behalf I'm speaking today.
Welcome, guys.
I'll speak for the women and say it's a pleasure to be here, Shreya. Thank you for inviting me.
To provide some context, India's 2019-2020 Time Use Survey results by the National Statistics Office reveals striking disparities in how Indian men and women allocate their time. Currently, women in India spend, on average, 5 hours and 33 minutes on paid work daily, as opposed to a little over 7 hours for men. But the gap widens when it comes to unpaid work, with women spending a lot more time on domestic chores, caregiving, and other household responsibilities. Findings show that women spend nearly 20% of their day in unpaid domestic work and caregiving. So for the purposes of this conversation, we thought it'll be good to define leisure as time free from work or from other obligations that can be spent on relaxation, rest, or personal enjoyment or socializing. So just amongst us, right? Like, what do we do for leisure? Kripa.
I don't invest so much time with solo pursuits that would count as maybe a leisure activity. I think whatever I do in leisure time has to be done in the company of others. That's the first thing. And then I think second, I do kind of struggle with the idea of having dedicated leisure time. I think I have fallen trapped to this, into the trap rather of this idea that even downtime that is not assigned to paid work should be construed as productive, and by a very traditional definition of what productive is, not productive for my, rest or rejuvenation or anything like that, but just that it's valuable in that sense. But when I overcome all these mental barriers, I think the things that I like to do are, I do like swimming a fair bit. I find that, even just downtime with friends doing not a very intensive activity like playing board games together. So there's a small social element, but you are sort of focusing your attention on a collective sort of task that you have for a game. I find that really enjoyable. And I think, I don't know if it counts, but like maybe volunteering to help out like for a community initiative or wherever an extra pair of hands is needed. I find that very personally rewarding. Does that fall into...
You classify that as leisure?
That's what I was going to say. I don't know if it classifies as leisure time, but if it falls outside the remit of paid labor, I guess I'm classifying it as leisure.
Volunteering at a board game place.
Something like this. Or... I also sing. Sorry, that's another thing. I spend a lot of time practicing to sing and then singing and then doing like choir performances and things like that. Yeah. So I personally find that to be my leisure time.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I'm so glad you brought up productivity. We can discuss that a little later, hopefully.
Sure.
Rijesh, what do you do for leisure?
We wait with bated breath.
We're putting him on the spot.
No, for me, it's the exact opposite, actually. I define leisure as any time I get to myself. And whatever I do within that time, outside of your day-to-day stuff is leisure. So read, some days just sit out and veg in front of a TV. Some days just... Actually, recently I've gotten into the habit of just walking out of the home, walking to the nearby bus stop, just catching a bus and going to the last stop wherever that bus goes and comes back. I find that it's tough to call it leisure in Bangalore, but given I'm voluntarily doing,
I've always wanted to do that.
so I do define it as leisure every once in a while. So yeah, so things where time that I get to spend by myself, where there's no expectation that I'll be doing X, Y, or Z, is leisure for me. So yeah, that's what I would define. What about you,
Interesting.
Shreya?
I've been trying to get a lot of leisure constantly, only because I tend to sort of then get lost in work. And like Kripa said, is it productive? Is this something that I need to do right now? And the sort of that gets pushed off. But off late, I've been making more time for swimming, for jigsaw puzzles. I'll even take a walk just to sort of unwind and relax. But I've been making time for a bunch of activities. I hope to sort of have more things that I can do to sort of, build on that. But, something about the studies also was that while we spoke about in our intro for this talk, I spoke about how the time that men and women spend on formal work and what they spend on unpaid work, with women spending a lot of time on unpaid work. The time use results for time spent on socializing and leisure are not that different for men and women. Women spend about less than half hour lesser than men. So they both genders spend about 2.5 hours approximately. Women a little lesser than men. But I think that I wonder if the increasing question is also that while a lot of working women especially have access to leisure and different types of leisure activities they can sort of make time for in their day, there is also this larger question of fragmentation of leisure time itself. Time spent on leisure itself is very fragmented, only because there is formal work and then there is informal unpaid work. Those lines become blurry when you're, say, working from home or if you have family at home. And so along with asking if do women have time for leisure, I would also add that is this time spent on leisure effective? Is it too fragmented for a lot of women to sort of really engage in?
I would actually also ask if it even is actually leisure, right? This is something we spoke about earlier as well, Shreya, where you were mentioning how women might construe watching television while cutting vegetables as leisure. And and when you said that, I actually remember that my mom always does that. She always does that. And if you ask her, she'll be like, "Yeah, why waste time watching TV?"
Yeah.
And she would construe that as downtime. So it's not just acts. Yeah, maybe men and women spend the same amount of time on leisure, but is it the same quality of time? Right? Are women getting the same quality of access that men do? I think is interesting to ask.
I was watching an episode of The Office yesterday while washing dishes.
Yay.
So there you go. Real life example as well that I've thrown in there.
Yeah.
But that's so interesting. It's true that, like, if we are bringing up the question of leisure time, but then even once women do have access to it, what is the quality of that time?
I think it says a lot about how women also perceive leisure in that, and also some amount of work around the house, some sort of informal chores, in that you also sort of club leisure along with some aspects of what you find enjoyable, along with informal work to sort of make that more enjoyable, more palatable, to also get that done, to sort of increase productivity. So it sounds like you're also using leisure to sort of hack your own productivity. But leisure also has like very direct benefits on productivity if engaged completely, right? Like,
sure, if you can actually dedicate that time to leisure to, in fact, do something leisurely.
Yeah.
I was actually, not to interrupt your train of thought, but I was just thinking that maybe it also depends on where the leisure activity takes place. I think it may, from the anecdotal examples now that we've brought up, it's harder still to do something leisurely while at home, maybe for women. Like this idea that as soon as you're in that physical space, all associated with it is all the associations of, I need to, this idea of upkeep or clean or something, versus leaving your home, going to a gym, going to a pool facility, going to some other place that denies you the opportunity to do what you would consider those conventionally productive things.
I think so.
Maybe
a great
that's
point.
something, it's valuable to know.
Yeah. And a lot of work around the house is very staggered. It's not like knowledge work that can sometimes be where you can start a task and finish a task.
Right.
If it's a small enough task. A lot of work around the house can be staggered, and that you have to do this and then wait X amount of time to do the
Right,
next
yeah.
thing, and then that has to happen. And so it becomes, I think that's also why that time is then, you sort of substitute that time with activities that can be enjoyable
Filler,
for a person, but it's not exactly leisure. Okay.
Interesting. So I kind of see it slightly differently. I mean, again, the example is of my mom or my sister post her marriage. The way I see it is that for women, leisure is not something that is a contiguous block of time or planned. It's just something you sort of squeeze out of the everyday demands of your like household work, of your unpaid leave, basically, because that's constantly coming, and it's kind of unpredictable when what will happen and who will have a demand on your time. So you're essentially just trying to squeeze out the leisure where you can, and that's turned into this sort of expertise, if you will, at mixing the leisure with the work and claiming or
Doing this at the
believing
same
that
time.
that is a form of leisure. So it's a conditioned response into believing that something is leisure just because you manage to squeeze some blocks of time out of your day-to-day work. So
Yeah. And I've read about how the studies also show that, in that it's anecdotally known that time spent on leisure between men and women is not properly recorded, only because there is this sort of gray area in women also getting some small amounts of leisure between tasks, and sort of adding all of that together and saying I get X amount of leisure. I'm wondering if that's a possibility, because the report that I was referring to earlier says that they just get a few minutes of leisure time lesser than men. So I feel like there are a lot of questions to ask about what questions were asked and what were some of the parameters that were given to them to respond to.
Yeah.
I
mean, at the same time, I don't want to lose sight of what we said earlier, which is the quality of that leisure time.
Yeah.
Like, is it fair to record those bursts of I'm watching an episode while doing the dishes or cutting veg or whatever?
Yeah.
Is it fair? Does that qualify as truly being leisure time? So maybe it shouldn't be included in the tally when we're counting. But so maybe time outside.
The counterpoint to that is that ultimately leisure is what you think it is, right? If you define something as leisurely for you, then why should somebody else say that that isn't leisure, right?
This is true, but I think we're defining, or the discussion is an important one, because we see all the benefits to leisurely time understood in a particular definition.
Yeah, no, I
like the benefits you actually can take from leisure time is when it's
Correct. Some of this can
You're
be
right.
healthy, Rijesh, in that if, say, I'm going swimming in the evening, I need a block of time for about 2 hours, just getting there, swimming, and then getting back. I might bunch a few tasks before and sort of make that more enjoyable to sort of get more done. Which you will if you want to sort of sustain doing that activity. I think you will sort of find something that works for you. Find the least painful way of doing that activity. But then if it means that I will get some amount of like a block of leisure time, that makes sense to do.
Yeah,
And
you're willing to then. Yeah.
I think it also an article I was reading on the topic also referred to this, in that a lot of working women have found sort of ways to make leisure time for them in India by just stacking tasks, being a little innovative about how they do activities. So it seems to be the case.
So interesting. Also, just this idea of having to try and be as efficient and effective in the limited time in a day, like just this. So this idea of, what are the expectations also placed on women, that you have to now go to this place of like, okay, if I can just club activities 5, 7, 9 together, then I can just get through my day checking off this endless task of, things that I need to get done. But I think Rijesh was about to say something.
No, I was going to ask Shreya if what you said about women learning how to stack tasks so that they can find or carve out leisure time. Is that something specific to women, or do men not need to do that? Is there a difference? I would assume that it's the same, right?
I think it's the same. This article that I read was specifically about women's participation in leisure and just their perceptions about leisure in India. And it spoke about that. But I'd assume it's the same. If men um, are sort of playing a sport, you would still need to sort of finish all of your tasks before, right? What's your take on that?
I think so. I don't know otherwise. So that's why I was asking. So since we're
Yeah,
talking
I
somewhere
think
on
I think
leisure,
more so the article
sorry,
spoke.
sorry. I just had a quick question. I mean, while we've been talking about what leisure is and how we carve, why is leisure important? Can we answer that question?
Very important question. So, yeah, we were going to get to that, but yeah, let's do that. So, it's also said that leisure is a indicator to sort of have a look at how free a society is. Um,
Yeah.
so, like I was saying, leisure is sort of an indicator of how free a society is. It also tells a lot about indicators of health, well being, happiness, a sense of purpose, agency. I think it says a lot about personal fulfillment, even. So, it builds on all of that on an individual capacity and I guess also on a community level. Um, so I think that's also where this conversation of leisure is coming. But its benefits aside, it also really is a wellspring for productivity itself, right? I mean, it's very counterintuitive in that we're being productive to make more time for leisure. But participating in leisure is helps you be more productive overall. Um, it also helps you show up better in the spaces that you do show up in. And reports show that there's a marked difference in sort of quality of how you show up in a space. If you're sort of burnt out, without time for yourself, sort of constantly going from one project to the other, it shows up in your contribution in that space, and how sort of proactive or engaged you are in that space. So, I mean, of course, these are generalizations, but leisure contributes to a lot of that. Is something that's documented. Of course, it's also a very difficult phrase to sort of pin down, which is also why I don't think it's been studied very extensively academically. In that, it's hard to pin down what leisure is. Do you stick to the physical attributes of leisure, or do you talk about the quality of leisure and how that impacts, you know, your own presence in a new environment or in the places you frequent? Do you talk about health benefits? Do you talk about how it sort of impacts your relationships? It's really hard to pin down in that sense that these are 10 or these are X number of benefits that leisure has in across different physical, how you show up, all of that. So yeah, so it is really important, bottom line. um, it's just hard to quantify in that sense. There have been studies done with very specific demographies. Like you will find very small group surveys that have been done in India, with like specific groups of people, rural and urban, that have studied this, but nothing on a very large scale, nothing you can put together and then see how that looks.
Yes, as you said, if it's difficult to measure, then really there's no incentive for anybody to study it, right? Because it can't really be measured well. But I was also thinking leisure is obviously important from a individual perspective, but it also is quite important from a society's perspective, right? I mean, if you just think, if a society is focused on creating leisure time for itself, like the individuals in a society are, then there's also an incentive for society to create spaces where relaxed interactions can happen. But if leisure is not important in a society, then you're not going to see those kind of spaces where people interact. I mean, the spaces will become more and more transactional. You'll meet people in a
Yeah,
metro station or you'll meet them at a
yeah,
mall. It'll all become, the leisure and the
yeah,
transactions will kind of overlap, right? I mean, and I think you see it in our cities today. There aren't. I mean, there's the odd park here and there, but really, the city is not
yeah,
built around the idea of leisure for its citizens. And maybe that's because we don't ask for it.
yeah. This brings to mind a talk that me, Kripa, and our colleague Bharat had about third spaces, which was about public spaces and access to public spaces even. And yeah, that's extremely lacking, right? We have very few infrastructure resources on, like, say, skating rinks, swimming pools, sports facilities, to name the least. That definitely seems to be the case. But isn't it also about personal perceptions at scale? Like, individually, you don't, if you sort of as an individual don't make time for leisure or don't value it, then also as a society, you're not, there isn't an incentive for society to, that's also what you're saying. But there is also a lack of demand in that sense, no, like, of continued demand.
There is, but I think that just reflects the structure of our society, right? I mean, see, the fact is that this conversation we are having is an extremely privileged conversation. For many people, leisure is just not possible. They don't have the time for leisure at all, right? And that's a large chunk of the population. And even within that large chunk that has no time for leisure, I'm sure women are disproportionately impacted in having no leisure even within that group. So, given that this is a, I don't want to say niche, but this is still a very, like, this is still not something important for a vast majority of our population. It's no surprise that society does not pay that much attention to it. There are more important problems to solve for. So, given that, when we need to think about what is the lowest cost or the least resist, I mean, like the path of least resistance to create leisure time for people, right? Where you are not dependent on society building a lot of infrastructure or things changing in drastic ways.
I was just in that vein, like one of the thoughts that was percolating in my mind as we started this train of discussion was just the idea of how the perception of leisure time varies depending on whether you're in a more individualistic culture versus a more communitarian culture.
Yeah.
I feel like it's so hard for me not to see so many of these issues through those lenses, right? This idea that as much as, you're saying that, oh, there's so many other things that we as society are caught up in, but like culturally that is sort of the acceptable path forward, is that you have to care about your community, and caring about your community is investing time in more work that supports your family, or doing more, caring about the community in that way maybe, but not seeing caring for community as, if I care for myself and afford myself more leisure time, I can care better. Like, that seems like a little bit of a slightly more nuanced and complex thought, whereas in more individualistic cultures, it's just understood that, I, the individual, I'm prioritizing my well-being, forget about
Right.
society, community, whatever. And so therefore, don't disturb me from 6 to 7 because that's when I'm going for a swim.
Interesting.
And so I think that's also really just that mindset challenge, like before we even get to like infrastructural challenges of whether that's accessible, but just even the
This
frame
sounds
of
so
mind.
much more convoluted when we say it in that I want to focus on myself so I can participate better as a member of the community. Whereas
But
it
see,
can be a
even
lot
that might
easier.
be an argument from a communitarian standpoint, right? Because you're saying, ultimately, I want to be of service to the community and society, and that is going to be my motivation to dedicate time to myself. Like, we are approaching it still from the benefit of, I think, versus why can't I invest in leisure time simply because I feel at ease, it's better off for me, and that's it. It doesn't have to be tied to the benefit then I, in turn, as a rested individual or all of that, bring to the broader community and society, right? So
But that's incidental anyway, right? I mean, I hope nobody is carving out leisure time for themselves because they want to be of service to the community. Ideally, what you want to say is, I mean, this is my leisure time, and as a result, if I'm more rested and I'm more useful in the community, that's good. But that's hopefully not the central point of people carving out leisure time for themselves.
But that's also the thing, no, Rijesh, in that it's, I mean, I know it sounds murky, but it's also hard for women, it looks like, to sort of validate for themselves that taking time out for themselves
is inherently worth it.
As opposed to some of the short-term things that they need to work on, whether at work or at your home. Kripa was talking earlier about how a lot of people of color also use leisure strategically.
So I can expand on that maybe. So we were just chatting briefly about how is leisure time understood and my point of reference is going to be North America, right? Like, so again, such a maybe some sweeping statements might be made, but there have been documented examples, and I remember reading this very thought-provoking and poignant kind of like op-ed piece that came in like a mainstream publication, and it just generated so much conversation, this idea of being a person of color occupying a professional space. And it was an op-ed written by a Black woman, and she was just talking about how just her struggles of being recognized as a credible and legitimate voice in her workplace. And she was, a very accomplished individual in her profession. But one of the arguments she put forward to argue for more credibility in the workplace was like, I actually partake in activities that my white peers partake in, and even still I'm not accepted. And so that was really interesting, because she was essentially then saying that she's strategic about her leisure time. And I think it's not just her experience. I actually think that she speaks for a larger group of people. When you are in the margins, and now again I'm taking it to a more individualistic society that deals with struggles like this, societal challenges like, racial discrimination and prejudice and things like that, that impede your experience as a professional and just existing in mainstream society. But she was essentially arguing that she used leisurely time that she had to be strategic about her place in the workplace, and to sort of say that if all my white peers are going to ad nauseum talk about hockey, I better get invested in those activities, because that makes me a more acceptable member of that society, because there's a point of reference that the majority group understands. Oh, okay, yes, hockey, versus, me talking about what might be a more, I don't know, a culturally significant sort of leisurely activity, whatever that looks like, insert activity.
Yeah.
But choosing to forego maybe even instinctively what she may have wanted to do, simply because she knows that if she has a limited amount of time in a day and she's struggling, already with like having a legitimate voice, why not use this as a means, a bit of a Trojan horse to get into where she wants to professionally. And I thought that was so fascinating. And I mean, not to say that she's doing it entirely for that purpose, but the fact that it even factors in some way, I thought was really interesting.
So it's possible to be sort of misguided about, or I think misguided is not the right word exactly, but sort of using leisure to sort of also further professional goals, especially when leisure can also be so fragmented in daily life for a lot of women.
I was actually going to say, I don't think this is true also for only the North American context, right? We think of business conversations and working lunches and all these things that exist, or going out, maybe you take a client or a partner out for a sporting activity to do together, because that's a strategic way that you can advance your goals, but you're also doing it under the guise of a leisurely activity. And that happens, in so many other places beyond just,
it happens
North
everywhere.
America,
I mean, it happens
sure.
with, like, I have friends who've gone to the US, and then to fit in, to belong to their group, they've picked up an interest in in the NFL and in football and all of that, right? I mean, they've never watched it before they went to the US, but now they do, and they like it. It is usually for them now. It wasn't when they started doing it. So just because something is a strategic choice doesn't make it not leisure. Thank God.
And it's interesting that even as we spoke about, individualistic societies versus more communitarian, the prompt still for a lot of what we just discussed is to belong to the community. You still feel as much, so there's that pressure that you also feel. You may still be an individualistic society, but this idea of belonging to a larger community is valuable seemingly regardless of cultural context. Everyone wants to have that feeling like, I belong somewhere, or I'm a part of a certain group. And that holds true even in individualistic societies.
Interesting. So we've been talking about like the productivity and leisure and how they sort of blur into each other a lot, quite a bit. We haven't spoken about other challenges to leisure, which are plenty. There are a bunch of books that have spoken about this in the Indian context, whether it is like access to public spaces in cities like Mumbai, or personal safety. There is quite a bit that's spoken about it. There's also this very interesting book on sorry, I will add all of this to the show notes. I'm not going to be able to say the book names right now. There's also this book that talks about informal labor for women, but not at home, like actual work that is in the informal space that sort of they do from home-based work, and that takes up a lot of time, and how that's also a big deterrent to leisure is not even part of the conversation for a lot of these women. And societal and cultural norms aside, there are quite a few of these challenges as well that women need to navigate, looks like. you know but
It's interesting because when
but yeah,
the Karnataka government's Shakti scheme, right, where they offered the bus services free for women. There was a very
That's
interesting
so sweet.
article in the Deccan Herald a while back, which where this lady was in. She interviewed a lot of the women who were using it, and what she found was that the economic cost of traveling long distance in buses was so high that when that had gone to zero, she actually met a lot of women who were like groups of women who were traveling for free in these buses and going to places that they could not go to before. Like this group leaves in the morning, they cover 4 or 5 temples, and then they come back home in the evening. Sometimes even the male folks will be going along, so it's an entire family out on a vacation, and just the reduction in the cost at a family level enabled
Wow.
leisure time for that family as a whole, and they were thrilled. And she listed, there were some 4 or 5 examples she gave of women which were like only women only groups who said, look, earlier we would never have even dreamt of doing this, but now we just get together, pick up our Aadhaar cards, get on the bus, and go wherever we need to go. So it was a very interesting example of how something as simple as that kind of opened up leisure opportunities. So there might actually be economic reasons why it's not possible, especially in India. Given
Sure. But do you feel like the economic, I'm just following that train of thought, like, do you feel like the economic reasoning as being the barrier for women to participate in some of this is overvalued or weighted more for women than it is for men? Like, do you feel like men similarly feel that leisurely activities are not possible because it's cost prohibitive? Or do you feel like women overestimate, like really overstate why,
I think
or
women
that typically for women it's considered?
overcompensate on the economic side. Women are more likely, I think, than men to say, "Oh, this thing is too expensive. Let me forgo that and use it towards the family." Men are more likely to say, "Yeah, it is expensive, but I still am going to do it because it is my leisure." I do think that difference exists, and that
yeah,
is
working
reflexive
moms
of
tend to spend
patriarchy,
less.
whatever you want to call it. Right? That's
So,
Yeah,
what were you saying, Shreya?
working moms tend to spend lesser. They're more careful about their expenditure. They are they sort of want to spend more on children's education, nutrition, growing child's requirements,
Yeah.
all of that sort. So they're not that quick to sort of make an impulse choice to spend on leisure.
Particularly if it's leisure that benefits only them.
Only them, yes. They
Yeah.
they don't see that correlation at all. Yeah.
so. Then,
So,
given that,
hmm.
I mean, if we agree on this idea that that women tend to, let's say, self censor their own access to leave for the family, or in how we want to put it, what kind of interventions would make sense to address that problem? How would you solve this problem? This is a societal, sort of a cultural problem, right? It's a cultural thing. How do you change it?
Interestingly, the leisure market in India has been growing slightly every year. You'll find a lot more players who are providing lots of like in person and at home activity ideas. You'll find, especially after COVID, there is this whole foray of like at home kits, leisure kits. You'll find all sorts of things like paint by numbers, sewing. And this is definitely something that's come up over the years, and I think it might also increase going forward. um, there's also the employer sponsored leisure program that a lot of companies have or have experimented with, in which an employer sort of supports your participation in chosen leisure activities at your discretion, and they fund it for the year. That's something that a lot of employers have tried. um, I don't know if those have been successful. I read somewhere that women also find this stressful, in that participating in this is also, because it's mandated and it's often
Right.
And it's
required.
often set around the preferences of
Participating
the men in that organization.
How many times did you go for? I'm not going to have an example there, but yeah, how many times did you play export in a particular week? Yeah, that's true. Maybe that's a
Yeah.
Or they'll say that, we're going to have a dinner as a team thing.
sure.
And for women, it's a problem because they need to get back home at a certain point of time, right? They've got kids at home, they have things at home to tend to. So a dinner may not work out for them. So unless you're cognizant of that,
Or it's a team sport.
or a team sport, or you say, oh, we'll go play for 2 hours in the evening and then let's go have a drink or something. That doesn't work out for women, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's a problem. And then you get into the whole, how do you say no to it? And if you say no, then that is
Right.
seen badly, whatever. So that's
Yeah.
the whole. I'm not a fan of employer-led
Mandated.
schemes of
We
this.
gather that.
I'd much rather that you let people find their own leisure time. If you have enough time to do leisure in the office, let them leave early and let them go find their own leisure.
Sure.
So that's also seen as like an obligation they have to navigate. And it can be a cause of stress depending on how busy your schedule is outside of work. So that's definitely one thing that employers have tried in the past. We've spoken a little bit about market solutions in that more people, I think, who enjoy leisure and find that there are gaps for people accessing leisure are coming up with interesting solutions on like a do-it-yourself kit. If you can't go to a place that teaches you to do this leisure activity with a larger community, maybe you can compromise and sort of do that by yourself until you can find the time and the resources to go participate in that pottery class or that origami class. You do it at a smaller scale at home or with a few friends. So those sort of options are coming.
Yeah, I mean, and in this instance, I mean, even as we're discussing this, there is that there is a particular type of person that we are thinking of in our mind, right? Like it probably is someone who's in an urban setting, who has access to a disposable income, maybe is in a double income household. Like we're thinking of all of that. But I'm just thinking of, going back to when we started the conversation of how we all kind of defined leisure differently. Like Rijesh's example being that leisure is time that you have to yourself, kind of. But yeah, so maybe that looks different, because I'm just thinking, then what does an intervention look like for maybe a woman in a rural setting where leisurely time is never going to maybe look like a at-home kit that's going to be delivered, but it might look like at 4 p.m. we all go for chai, and I know that people in my society or neighborhood might step out for something, I don't know what it is, or you invite people over for a chai, which still, maybe is not considered leisurely, but this idea that, okay, I'm doing something with others. I can't be cutting vegetables necessarily while I'm talking, possibly. I don't know. I really
That example is
extrapolated.
very interesting because I can't ever recall seeing a bunch of women sitting at a chai ki tapri having chai and conversation. It never happens. You only see guys doing that.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So maybe
So
isn't
true,
it?
huh?
Yeah.
So when you see guys,
I'm so glad, Kripa,
and when you
you
see
brought
guys
that
doing
up.
that, you don't actually see. If you saw a bunch of women doing that, I'm sure people would give second glances and wonder what's happening. So maybe there is actually a problem.
Exactly. I'm so glad. Look at me being glad profusely. It's just I miss mentioning this just because oftentimes I find that I enjoy this topic, but there's so much murkiness around it and there's so much depth in it that I get lost in the depth sometimes. But this is I think a very interesting point in that women, especially women in rural India and a lot of cities in the country don't think of leisure in like positive terms. It's often seen as
Wasting time.
like wasting time, like you're lazy, you're purposeless, you're without purpose. You want your own volition, out of your own volition, you want to spend time doing nothing or things that don't contribute to much economically or towards the family or some sort of growth that's outside of yourself. In fact, I read a study recently that looked at leisure in rural farmers in India, where women who had the least amount of leisure had the highest levels of agency, personal agency, that they felt they were doing a lot for their family because they had no free time. They spent half the day in the farm, which is still lesser than how much men spent, time spent. But the rest of the time they spent at home cooking, cleaning, doing other chores around the house, and they felt more fulfilled. And I'm just like, I don't know how to make sense of this light of this conversation. And this happens to me often with this topic. And I'm just like, what?
But
it comes also back, I think, to what Rijesh was saying. Sorry,
no, go
Rijesh, go on.
finish your thought.
Yeah, I was saying that it came back to this idea of what what society sort of values. At one point, I think that you had mentioned that of, what, maybe I'm misremembering, but a little bit lost my train of thought there. But the idea that, if we're in a society that has deemed certain activities as valuable or certain traits as being worthy of aspiring for, then of course it would follow then a lot of the activities that women would invest their time in are those that fall into those pre-prescribed values that are deemed worthy of pursuing in a society.
But to Shreya's point, right, I'm not surprised that the women with the least amount of leisure time believe themselves to have the highest agency, because if they had no leisure time and they still did not think they had agency, then that's a horrible outcome, right? The cognitive dissonance is too high, right? Because you're choosing to forgo the leisure to
That
do
is a more
things that
dystopic.
society says is valuable. So obviously you must believe you have agency, otherwise why would you do it? So that's not surprising to me. I think it's fine.
You must believe
Fine
that's
that, I mean, thank God it works that way. Otherwise, that's like terrifying. If you had no leisure and you were doing things that you thought were not valuable, that would be very bad.
Right, seriously.
I agree. Yeah, I mean, guess about cognitive dissonance, right? It would be extremely strange. But my point of surprise is not so much that they believe that, but that we're so far away from understanding leisure even before you can sort of have a conversation about it, that more people can have a conversation about it and we do something about it.
To me, it's like, I don't know if leisure can be thought of as a social or a societal level problem. While I understand your point that citizens or people having access to leisure may have good benefits at a societal level, I still think it's a very personal choice, right? So, like, I don't think this is something that you will solve with state intervention or with at societal level intervention. Maybe some cultural norms need to change, but by and large, what one could think about is the opportunities for leisure, right? As long as there are more opportunities, like if there's a market for leisure, that people, that say some kind of private players fill in with offerings, whatever those may be, right? Then people will find ways to, like, maybe the things that are available for my leisure are just not that interesting, and so I'm like, yeah, it's okay, I'll forego it, right? If my only option is to go watch a movie in a mall or go to a restaurant, eat out, and I don't like either of those things, but there isn't a third option,
Sure.
I can't go swimming, there isn't a park,
Right.
then I might say, you know what, forget it, right? So maybe what we really need to think about is, how do you improve that market for leisure? How do you bring more private offerings into it? As opposed to saying, can we solve it at a societal level? Because maybe you can't. Everybody defines leisure differently. So how do you agree that, how does everybody agree on something as being leisure, right?
And everyone has their own motivations for what they deem important and what's most necessary for them to do in context of their lives and their families' lives. And yeah, totally.
Yeah, I'll say all of the above. Let's do it all. Let's have more options. Let's introduce more infrastructure. Let's challenge societal norms. Let's have people maybe who are in positions of influence and authority, possibly signaling. I would love to see like a more leaders who have room to be influential, showing that they spend time doing something leisurely.
Yeah.
That's kind of cool, I think.
Yeah.
Could do.
I think that's how it also trickles down, right?
Yeah.
I would argue that the Prime Minister of India has done a very good job of that. He has been snorkeling in Lakshadweep. He's done meditation in the caves. So,
Wonderful. So
I'm not being sarcastic. He's genuinely done enough things that might be construed as leisure. So, he is setting a good example.
Okay, then I have no further notes, I think, for him.
On that note, for all listeners, what do you all do for leisure? What do the women in your lives do in their free time? If you'd like to let us know, please write to contact@takshashila.org.in.
I'd like to hear people also, if I can chime in here, who don't care for doing anything leisurely. Why? I'd love to hear their thoughts too.
Yeah. We've discussed both of these things and they both are very plausible. Thank you, Kripa. Thank you, Rijesh, for entertaining this conversation on leisure and for women.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Such a pleasure. And a thank you to all the men. I guess that's Rijesh. Thank you to Rijesh for speaking for the men on this call.
For sure.
I was hoping I don't get beaten up.
I mean, just don't step outside of your house for 24 hours.
Exactly. I'm going to have some leisure. I'm going to make some leisure time.
Leisure time. That's what I want to hear.
Getting leisure and watching your back. Thanks, folks.
All right.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle at Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.